Welcome to Weekends with Anna Kasparian and Michael Brooks. I'm Michael Brooks.
I'm Anna Kasparian.
We have another great episode for you. This is episode number 2, and we are here this week with Aaron Bastani of Novara Media. We're talking about the revelations of the Labour Party's war against Jeremy Corbyn. Their war in 2017, which very likely cost us a Corbyn government, which could have saved who knows how many lives at this point. Of course, we've got our commentaries. We're talking about, do the Democrats actually want to lose? Avoiding a new Cold War with China? What's the correct strategic position? And of course, we've got assault, and we've got a whole bunch of other goodies for you. Of course, we're here on the Jacobin. Smash the like button, hit subscribe. Thank you to Cale Brooks producing this enterprise. Anna, how you doing?
I'm doing well, considering everything that's happening in the country, in the world, keeping myself busy, which you definitely have been doing as well. Just trying to keep it together.
Just trying to keep it together.
Yeah. It's just, just seeing what's happening with the general election in our country. We're going to definitely draw some parallels between, what we're experiencing and what's happening with the Labour Party in the UK. It's just, this is really the time to put together this type of programming where we talk about not just current events and news, but what our next move needs to be, right? And how to strategize more effectively moving forward. So you've been having a lot of great conversations on TMBS that have been enlightening for me. So I like the focus on strategy. I think we really need that.
No, the strategy, I mean, as horrible as it is, I think there's something that's really difficult and really unpleasant, but kind of liberating about just the truth of where we're at. Big losses. I think there's a kind of bigger picture that we'll get to with Bastani, that you can kind of connect the election of Syriza in Greece to Bernie 2020. These really important political parties, really important social movements that have not won, at the end of the day. They've been blocked by either the European Union or the right wing of the Labour Party or MSNBC, whatever, all of these institutional barriers. And then we've seen and still continue to see the steady rise of a neo-authoritarian right-wing politics. And but as Adolph Reed, said, we at least have the advantage of Trump being an unfocused moron.
Yeah, definitely. I mean, I guess it's like a dark upside, I guess, or an upside to a really dark moment. But it is an upside because if Donald Trump weren't as incompetent and buffoonish as he is, I think that he could cause much more damage than he's already caused. And that's saying a lot because, his response to this pandemic has been a complete and utter disaster. The willingness of Democrats in Congress to, respond to this pandemic with trillions in bailouts for corporations, disastrous. And I think we're going to, feel the ramifications of that for decades to come. But I agree with you. I think the truth really does set you free. So one, yes, you have to accept where you are, where the left is in this moment in history, but you also have to know who your enemies are. And I don't know if this does, speaks poorly of me, but I love knowing who my enemies are because you know who you need to fight.
Why would that speak poorly of you?
I don't know, because I think that there has been this messaging from the left for a long time about maybe being more conciliatory, being willing to work together, reach across the aisle, that nonsense. And also, I think for a long time, we've told ourselves all sorts of fantasies about how we can work with the centrists to get what we want. I mean, that was the heart and soul of Elizabeth Warren's campaign. And guess what? We can't. They are our enemies. They are to be fought. And, the conversation that we're going to have with Bastani today, I think is really going to highlight that. Because if you think that the centrists are going to help you accomplish the very things that would actually take power away from them, I mean, you say this all the time. I have a bridge to sell you, It's ridiculous.
I think liking knowing your enemies is very dipset of you, and I think it's great. The
Thanks.
you know, I also just want to say too, I think the other conversation that you and I have so much on TYT and TMBS and certainly together is definitely this idea, the dialectical relationship of that with building a much healthier left, a much less puritanical one, a much more strategic one, a much more healthy one, so that inside uh, your sort of general cohort that we're trying to do politics with, it's not about playing these weird maximalist games with each other and trying to destroy people over petty things or whatever else, and then actually combining that with a real serious strategic approach to power. And I think the way they intersect, and where I do go back to Adolf Reed all the time, is in recognizing that the road to this mass politics is through kind of reaching out in a grounded, non-subcultural way to all of the working class. And, it's especially important right now, because we're seeing this sort of countervailing argument of the sort of kind of like identitarian thing, which is all of these failures are actually attributable to not doing enough to try to, reach out to the oat milk market. And look, I've been known to order some almond milk myself, but I don't think that this is where a mass base comes from. And it's certainly also not where great labor breakthroughs come from. And it's also not where incredible leaders like a Lula comes from, which frankly, we need to prototype more in the United States.
I completely agree with you. I think an example that I would point to with current events would be the way that some on the left have been responding to the protesters in swing states. So, for instance, in Michigan, look, some of these protesters who refuse to follow through with stay-at-home orders are, boneheaded. You see some of the Proud Boys out there doing ridiculous things. And so I'm not talking about those protesters, but we do need to really come to terms with what really binds all of us. And that is the fact that these are working class people who are suffering financially in this pandemic. And our lawmakers have failed in providing real financial relief for these people. And so they've been told over and over again for decades that the government's not going to help them, that they need to pick themselves up by the bootstraps, that we live in this individualistic society where we all need to take care of ourselves and, screw everyone else. And so they have that propaganda in their minds. They're frustrated because they haven't been given real financial relief, and they don't know what to do because the only thing they've known is I need to work. I need to rely on myself to provide for my family. And they're being told that they can't do that. So we need to understand the psychology behind it and what we can do to actually reach out to those people, because those are working class people who are suffering under this system as well. And we might disagree with them when it comes to maybe their views on other things. But the one thing, again, that connects all of us is that we're all suffering under this rigged economic system where Congress is totally fine giving corporations trillions of dollars in bailouts. But when it comes to the average working class American, all they get is a one-time $1,200 check, maybe if the bank doesn't garnish it. And if they're lucky, they might be able to get through the state's unemployment system. But that system is operating with 1960s technology, and most people haven't been able to get through and file for unemployment. It's been a disaster.
Absolutely. It's been an absolute disaster. And I know that you're going to, and I agree with you 100%. I think those are such important points. We can't daily show it, oh, these people don't know facts. We can talk about the right-wing elements. We can talk about the DeVos family and the AstroTurf elements, but we can't get away from the fact that, just as you say, there's a lot of people who are not getting properly bailed out and they need to work for a living. And if the answer isn't a serious social democratic program, then you just give more material to the fake pseudo-populist bullshit right. And I know we're going to get to more of that in your awesome commentary that you have prepared. So let's get to the commentary sections. And I actually want to talk a little bit this week about how to think about and how to talk about China, which is an enormously complicated subject. And I would say it's actually very hard to track here in the United States. There is no doubt that in the big picture, that the defense establishment, the military intelligence worlds in the United States and across part of the West are in a sort of Cold War setting with China. The discourse has changed radically. In the 1990s, there was this kind of dual notion that on one hand, at the end of the day, obviously, we wanted to trade with China, deindustrialize America, take advantage of cheap labor. And then in some kind of vague, non-substantive way, China would evolve on so-called human rights issues. Then under the Obama administration and Bush administrations, following on a pretty similar trajectory until actually starting with Obama, the pivot to Asia, when there started to be a much more sort of hawkish approach to China in terms of China's currency manipulation, accusations about China stealing technology, and so on. And obviously that's really escalated with Trump. And inside the Trump world, there's kind of competing ways of dealing with China. Because on one hand, and people shouldn't forget this, people like Sheldon Adelson, the casino magnate, Republican megadonor, has deep relationships in China and does not want those disrupted as a primary Republican donor. On the other hand, Steve Bannon has sort of come back into relevance by turning his radio show into a sort of show that is theoretically about the pandemic and about Corona, but is really a virulent conspiratorial anti-Chinese program. That is trying to sort of whip up the drumbeat of a new Cold War-like setting with China. And I'll get to what I think the appropriate response is in the moment. But I want to play one full ad from a super PAC that supports Donald Trump, and then a minute and 40 seconds of a Twitter video, YouTube video that the Biden campaign put out. And I want to just set the groundwork here. Obviously, the Trump video is going to be much more sort of crude propaganda. The Biden video will echo the sort of rhetoric and style of the Obama era. But make no mistake, this is an argument between two different paths towards getting, quote unquote, tough with China. So, Kale, let's play the Trump super PAC first, and then we'll play part of this Biden ad.
For 47 years, the D.C. elite has made one country great. Joe Biden has led the charge.
I believed in 1979 and said so, and I believe now that a rising China is a positive development.
China stole American manufacturing and hoarded our emergency stockpile.
We're not trying to slow down Chinese growth.
Now more than ever, America must stop China. And to stop China, you have to stop Joe Biden. America First Action is responsible for the content of this advertising.
And you've seen talking points like this from the Trump campaign, certainly from Steve Bannon, and also from the Epoch Times, which is a shadowy, virulently anti-Chinese newspaper, which seems to have bought up 70% or so of all YouTube advertising. You're likely seeing one of those ads if you're watching this show. Let's watch a response from the Biden campaign. Who is really weak on China, according to Joe Biden?
President Trump is trying hard to revise history, again, but the facts don't back him up. Hi, I'm Tony Blinken. I was Deputy Secretary of State during the Obama-Biden administration, and I'm now the Senior Foreign Policy Advisor to the Biden campaign. Let's talk about President Trump, China, and the coronavirus, and how President Trump failed to hold China to account when it mattered most. Barack Obama and Joe Biden put in place extra safeguards to predict, prevent, and deal with pandemics, especially those originating in China. We kept a strong CDC presence on the ground there. We even had an American expert stationed in the Chinese Disease Control Agency to be our eyes and our ears. President Trump dismantled or diminished virtually all of it. He closed the White House Pandemic Office. He cut the number of CDC experts in China from 47 to 14. He left that key position that was our eyes and ears vacant in the months before the outbreak. In early January, after the outbreak started, the CDC wanted to get into China to get information to protect Americans. China said no. and President Trump didn't push. Why not? Because he was so focused on getting a deal with China to fix his costly trade war. As the virus was spreading and the warning signs were flashing red and intelligence reports were raising the alarm, President Trump was signing and celebrating a trade deal with China. This was the time to get tough with China, to demand access and information that could help us stop the spread. But President Trump didn't insist because he didn't want to put his trade deal at risk. In fact, as things were getting worse in China, and as China was keeping the door shut to our experts, President Trump embraced Chinese leaders, praising their efforts and transparency. On January 22nd, 2 days after the first case of COVID-19 is confirmed in the United States, President Trump says he has, quote, a great relationship with President Xi, and they, quote, just signed probably the biggest deal ever made, end quote.
You trust that we're going to know everything we need to know from China?
I do. I have a great relationship with President Xi.
So it's very important right now to recognize that there is a bipartisan convergence in terms of a more aggressive stance towards China. Now, are there problems with the Chinese government? Are there legitimate areas of policy dispute? Are there legitimate areas of concern with human rights? No question. But let's be really clear here. The Chinese foreign policy is nothing even remotely on the scale of the aggression and hegemonic influence of the United States. We need to be real about that. Secondly, part of what China's done is evolve economically, which should be the interest and goal of all developing states, and something that most developing states cannot do because of direct U.S. influence through the World Bank and IMF. The Chinese have used their position to support the growth of domestic industries and take advantage of developing its own intellectual properties and technology applications. Why should we have a xenophobic attitude about 5G when they accept the role, which they certainly heavily monitor, of Google, Facebook, and Microsoft? Now, again, if we want to reframe this as a bigger conversation about privacy, data, and openness in general that implicates platform capitalism of Silicon Valley and what the Chinese are developing, well, of course, that's a very serious and important conversation. But it should not be fed in new Cold War terms. And it should not ignore the fact that China is almost always, in an international sense, behaving quite rationally as one would expect. Now, China's Asian neighbors have different perceptions. In fact, the Japanese, obviously a close ally of the United States, have been subsidizing and trying to help move production outside of China and move it to other Asian countries. All of these dynamics are complicated and difficult and almost never cleanly represented in the US press. The sort of mainstream Obama narrative is still a kind of more sophisticated version of quote unquote get tough for decades of essentially treating China as a giant sweatshop. And of course, now we have the new extreme xenophobia of the Trump administration. What we need is an anti-New Cold War, thoughtful analysis that recognizes that China is the world's new superpower. This is a G2 world. What does that mean? What does it mean for the prospects of the global environment? What does it mean for the prospects of workers' rights internationally? And why have we gotten to this world moment where the only conflict in the Chinese relationship in the United States is between the sort of 1% corporate sector that wants to continue on a relationship that has not worked in the main for workers in either country, as well, and then people who want to start a new aggressive hybrid war against China and facilitate a new Cold War. We need to resist both, and we need to have a much more intelligent discourse about one of the most complicated countries on earth.
Yeah, I think you're absolutely right. Just a few points I wanted to mention. You know, there's a lot of tough talk coming from both Democrats and Republicans, as you perfectly pointed out with those two ads, regarding, the new Chinese boogeymen and how we need to really fight them aggressively. But when it really boils down to like the financial aspect, of the relationship we have with China, no one's really interested in doing anything substantive, because while, Democrats might point to the human rights abuses, they absolutely have no problem with the human rights abuses that we're engaging in abroad. So Biden was asked, for instance, what he would do with the Iran sanctions in the middle of this pandemic, if he were in charge. He wouldn't lift those sanctions.
Right.
He wouldn't. And those sanctions have led to, countless lives lost in Iran. They're unable to get the medical supplies and medical equipment they need in order to keep their own citizens alive. That is a human rights abuse that we have engaged in. And not only did Trump impose those sanctions and rip up that Iran nuclear deal, I mean, the thinking would be that Biden would step in if he had any power in this situation and lift those sanctions and maybe re-implement the Iran nuclear deal. But he was asked about it and he wouldn't do that. So I think it's important to take that into account. We have a relationship with China because we want their cheap labor. And we have not only suffered from that in our own country when it comes to jobs being lost, but if we focus on the pandemic itself, I mean, we should have a lot of these medical supplies manufactured here in the United States, but we don't because it's more profitable for these companies that make these supplies to ship that labor abroad. And so, again, sometimes I hesitate to make this argument, but when it comes to like the fundamentals, there are so many similarities between Democrats and Republicans. And I think we need to come to terms with that. And I think you're absolutely right. There's always that citation of human rights abuses when both parties want to garner enough support to engage in some sort of, either Cold War or actually full-blown war with a different country. But we do need to really have a moment of self-reflection and see what type of human rights abuses we have in our own country and also abroad.
Yeah, I think you're 100% right. And I also think it's really important, again, to, be real as these things are hyped, that, of course, and I think, to deny that there aren't human rights abuses in China is delusional. To question the rhetoric and deployment of human rights in general is essential. But also, China does not support, China's not engaged in proxy wars across the globe. China's not supporting various factions and civil wars in multiple conflict zones. China's actually a contributor to UN peacekeeper forces. China has certainly seen and perceived itself with some real justification as a kind of productive, sovereign, respecting member of the international system. And I think, as we look at this new rhetoric against China, it's very important to see how the sort of they screwed us, right-wing xenophobia stuff, and then there's the sort of other end of, well, let's talk about how bad they are versus how bad, basically the United States and China is, as an example, if we want to talk about the global power relationships, and the fact that the United States is innately more relevant to talk about and understand because it is still by far the most hegemonic and powerful country in the world. It's not a moral statement. That's just reality. That is the ground point of analysis. And I also love what you said, too, which is that if you cede to the Josh Hawleys of the world, this idea of bringing manufacturing back to the United States and strategic industries, which is going to be a global trend right now. I mean, even Richard Haas from Council on Foreign Relations has acknowledged that the Japanese are moving very aggressively. Josh Hawley has this legislation specifically on pharmaceuticals and medical supplies. You cannot cede that terrain to the right. And I think this is another way in which the left needs to have a much more coherent and synchronized conversation, as I always say, about where things can be local, where there needs to be national nation-state projects as the nation-state continues to exist. And then, of course, on the other hand, I'll just end with this. Obviously, dealing with something like Corona is a major area for global governance. And with climate change and oceans and a variety of other issues, there's going to need to be deep and systemic cooperation with China to achieve change and see off problems in these areas. And again, that's just reality. That's balls and strikes stuff.
Mm-hmm. I don't know, Michael. These international organizations, they're just not doing their part. The World Health Organization really dropped the ball.
We have to actually do something about it, right?
No, I agree with you on that. But, it's just incredible how, one of Trump's strategies to basically place the blame on anyone other than him, because his response to COVID has been a disaster, has been to let's blame the World Health Organization. They're the ones who screwed it up. Let's blame China. They're the ones who screwed it up. And to be sure, there were certainly mistakes made. But I mean, it's ridiculous to ask Trump to take responsibility for anything. He refuses to take responsibility when it comes to his incredibly slow reaction and response to this virus.
Absolutely.
Yeah. All right. So let's talk a little bit about what's happening in the U.S. when it comes to the election and what we're seeing in terms of messaging from the Democratic Party, because there's a disconnect. I'm sure most people in the audience have noticed this disconnect, but it's becoming increasingly frustrating because this messaging is obviously in mainstream media, and it just completely ignores the fact that Democrats, the establishment, centrists, moderates, they have created a situation in which it doesn't matter to them whether Trump wins or Biden wins, because at the end of the day, they're going to win. Their stock portfolios are going to win. And I think their actions really highlight that. So moderate Democrats have been aggressively bullying Bernie Sanders supporters to not only support Joe Biden by voting for him, but to endorse Joe Biden. And I think those are two different things. Endorsing Joe Biden is making the case for why you think he's the best candidate, why you think he should represent this country, why you think he should represent you. Voting for him because he's the lesser of two evils is something different, right? So Brianna Joy Gray, the former national press secretary for the Bernie Sanders campaign, made it clear that she will not endorse Bernie Sanders. DSA did the same. And there was a full news cycle dedicated to shaming them and bullying them for their political views. But what I would ask is that the Democratic Party take a good hard look at itself and have a moment of self-reflection if, and I don't believe this to be true, if they claim that beating Donald Trump is the top priority. The reason why I don't think that's actually true is because the actions of the Democratic Party in the middle of this pandemic, where people are suffering financially, shows just how little they care about working Americans, how little they care about beating Donald Trump, and how little they're paying attention to the fact that Donald Trump, in some regard, is beating Democrats with a more leftist message. That might sound crazy, but let me make my case. So this week, we learned that 22 million people filed for unemployment because of this pandemic. People have been laid off. They've been fired indefinitely. And so the question is, what are they going to do now that they've lost the money that they've been making, their income? But on top of that, we have this broken system where health insurance is tied to your employer. So 22 million people not only lose their job, they probably also lost their health insurance in the middle of a pandemic where this virus is highly contagious and lethal for many people who have underlying health conditions. Donald Trump has decided to tackle this issue not by some bureaucratic method where he goes through Congress. He's actually decided to pump money into hospitals so the uninsured can have coverage for their coronavirus treatments through the money, the tens of billions of dollars he has just pumped into these hospitals. But Democrats have a completely different solution. They've proposed two things. Number one, they have proposed to reopen enrollment for Obamacare, which you would have to pay for. And people have been laid off. So how exactly would people pay for that? The second proposal is actually far worse. And so Sludge wrote about it in great detail, and I want to give you these details right now. So Democratic leadership in Congress are planning to include a measure in the next coronavirus package to expand subsidies for COBRA health insurance program, allowing people who lose their jobs to keep the same insurance plan that their employer had made available to them. Now, here's the catch. Under the plan, the federal government would pay the full cost of premiums to private health insurance companies to keep laid off people on their plans. But the COBRA expansion would not provide coverage to people who become unemployed, but were not receiving coverage through their employers. It would also not cover people's deductibles. And we know how insanely expensive deductibles are. And so to come in and say, all right, we're not going to cover certain people with this proposal, and then on top of that, we're not going to cover premiums, is out of control. I mean, because again, 22 million people just lost their jobs. They have no income. And working Americans were already in a precarious situation prior to the pandemic, where nearly half of Americans couldn't even afford a $400 emergency. So what kind of solution is this? It's absolutely ridiculous. On the other hand, you have someone like Donald Trump, again, pumping money into these hospitals in order to provide coverage for people who can't afford coronavirus treatment. So I'm going to skip ahead to what Trump is doing. And this was actually reported in Jacobin. I think this is an incredibly important piece that highlights how little Democrats really want to beat Donald Trump. Rather than lean on Obamacare to cover patients, the Trump administration opted to directly cover the cost of COVID-19 treatment for the uninsured. And again, that's a simple, unbureaucratic way of ensuring that people get the care that they need. Now, I want to be clear about one thing. Donald Trump is not some leftist. We all know this. Donald Trump cares about Donald Trump and only Donald Trump. He is thinking about his reelection, plain and simple. And he knows, based on what happened in 2016, that positioning himself as someone who is more to the left compared to the Democratic candidate plays well, because people have been suffering economically for decades and it's getting worse. And the pandemic has only, again, amplified that for a lot of people. And so what does the messaging from the Democratic Party say, not only when it comes to the policies they're proposing, but more importantly, by the stuff that everyone sees, everyone consumes on social media? Well, let me give you an example. Here's Nancy Pelosi showing off her gourmet ice cream collection in the middle of a pandemic where 22 million people have been laid off. Let's watch.
Speaker Pelosi, what have you found? What are you going to share with us from your home?
Chocolate.
Really?
Chocolate candy.
Oh, wow.
And this is something you can get through the mail.
Okay.
You never run out. Can I show you?
Me. Yeah, absolutely. This is the episode of Cribs I never knew I needed. Oh, my. Wow.
Other people in our family go for some other flavors, but chocolate, and then we have some other chocolate here.
So I want to be clear about, I'm not showing that video to, say that people can never have fun, that they can't have light segments or light interviews in the middle of a serious pandemic. I think that if you are a lawmaker, if you're part of Democratic leadership, you have an obligation to ensure that people are being taken care of, instead of, indulging in these types of like PR stunts where you're trying to become more relatable by showing off how much you love chocolate. I don't care how much Nancy Pelosi likes chocolate. That doesn't improve the lives of Americans who are suffering right now. And then look, Michael, I want to bring you in now. The sweater. Like, I know maybe I'm the only one who's like hyper obsessed with what she's wearing there, but like the yachting sweater, as she's showing off like her beautiful basket of gourmet chocolate, and then her giant Sub-Zero fridge, which costs, each one of those, by the way, costs $12,000. She has two of them. She opens that to show off her ice cream collection. Again, I don't care if people have those luxuries necessarily, but I do care when these are the same people who are just completely bullying the Brianna Joy-Grays of the world for not endorsing Joe Biden, because they think that Brianna Joy-Gray has all this power to prevent Biden from getting elected. No, Nancy Pelosi and people like her are what leads to the Democratic Party losing. They led to Donald Trump winning. And I actually think they're okay with that, because fundamentally, Donald Trump does not really challenge their power. Donald Trump doesn't, create a situation in which they're worried about their stock portfolios. And Donald Trump does provide an opportunity for Nancy Pelosi to position herself as the resistance, but it's all optics. Ripping up a speech is not real resistance. sarcastically clapping at Trump is not real resistance. If Democrats lose to Trump, it is not Bernie Sanders supporters' fault. It is the Democratic establishment's fault. And I think that they're actually fine with that.
Yeah, well, first of all, just the other day, I recorded an episode of Pod It Out with our mutual really good friend Nando Vila, where he's rewatching along with his great co-host Entourage. And we talked about an episode of Entourage, and it brought me back to this whole cultural terrain of like 2003, 2004. And Nancy Pelosi definitely looks like she's auditioning for an extra role in Wedding Crashers, of like the sinister grandma who Vince Vaughn has like a weird crush on. And she's into it. So yes, I definitely noticed that sweater. I think that's totally valid. Yeah, I mean, this is another thing that we've talked about. I think it's really important. Bill Barr at the DOJ has put in a recommendation. I don't know the state of it, but we've covered it, to allow for indefinite pre-trial detention in the times of emergency. It's an incredible threat. We know the whole apparatus of ICE and terrorism towards migrants and refugees and asylum seekers put in place under Stephen Miller in this administration. By the way, these are all the concrete and tangible reasons to understand that obviously Trump needs to go. It's not really that complicated. But on the other hand, this very big melodramatic discussion of Nazism and totalitarianism has really allowed people that are under no threat and will have, plenty of time to pontificate on cable news and be in Congress to basically wrap themselves in melodrama and not do anything. And another thing I want to note, not because I care about the hypocrisy, but just because we need to be real about power positions. Brianna Joy Gray can be hounded, or various, Twitter personalities or whatever, which, again, let's be frank, we don't have that much power. There's some power, there's some influence, but, this can be a major object of focus of sort of harassing people about not only supporting Biden over Trump, which, is my practical position. I won't hide the ball on that. But like to do it enthusiastically, or pretend that Biden is something other than what he is, or pretend that the Democratic Party is something other than what it is. Whereas, Joe Manchin, when he said during the primary that if Bernie was the nominee, he absolutely would not support the nominee. I don't even think he even committed to supporting another Democratic nominee. That's reported as, an important message from the moderate ring of the Democratic Party, even though, of course, we just know that, Joe Manchin and Kristen Sinema are just extreme corporatists who like to play to the far right, even more so than kind of average corporatists like Schumer or whatever. So, I say that again to just really point. I mean, it's worth noting the double standards, but it also should reinforce where we're at in terms of suction and leverage. And I would say for people like Mehdi Hasan, like hectoring and moralizing is not going to get the job done. If you want to actually persuade people, do it in a way that is I would say, frankly, a lot more, real and humble.
Mm-hmm. Mm-hmm. Yeah, I mean, definitely. I think that there's just far too much attention. I think you're right. The Bernie wing of the Democratic Party does not have the power to get Trump reelected, right? And I think that the bullying and the hyper focus on these voters and pressuring them to vote for Biden, but for some people, I think that it's genuine. I think for Mehdi Hasan, it's genuine. But I think for the Democratic establishment, it's about distracting and messaging in a way where people are just like focused on the least powerful people when it comes to the outcome of this election, right? So behind the scenes, they can do what they've always been doing. So I'm going to go down the laundry list of issues that you mentioned. I mean, ICE, for instance. Yep. You think that Nancy Pelosi is a resistor when it comes to the actions that we're seeing at the border right now? Are you kidding me? She fought progressives within her own party, within the House, more aggressively than she fought the Trump administration. She handed Trump a $4.6 billion blank check for border security. And when Representative Ocasio-Cortez spoke out against it, Pelosi went and had that New York Times interview with Maureen Dowd, to trash progressives because they had the audacity to speak out against that blank check. One other thing that's been happening through this pandemic that hasn't gotten much media attention, Democrats haven't done anything about it. The EPA announced that there will be no oversight of corporations during the pandemic. They can pollute, our air, our water, whatever they want, and they don't have to worry about any of the rules or any of the regulations. A story broke yesterday about how there will be no oversight when it comes to the amount of mercury that makes it into our environment. It's just disgusting. Yep. And yeah, you're absolutely right. I mean, William Barr wants to detain people indefinitely. Where's the resistance when it comes to that very real criminal justice issue? It's just nonsense. It's absolute nonsense. And, the more I look at the actions of the Pelosi's of the world, the more angry I get when they just hone in on progressives and they fight the progressives while all of our civil liberties, civil rights, all of that is being dismantled by the Republican Party right now. What kind of real resistance have we seen from them? And what kind of real proposals have we seen from the Nancy Pelosi's of the world to help people who are really struggling? Instead, we get that video, which, by the way, gets used by Donald Trump, because of course it does. Donald Trump understands optics. He understands marketing. So let's go. Yeah, perfect. So Charlie Kirk had tweeted, Nancy Pelosi sits in her $7.5 million San Francisco home in front of her $24,000 fridges, bragging about her stockpile of $13 a pint gourmet ice cream, all while 22 million Americans file for unemployment and funding for small businesses runs dry. Shameful. Now, again, caveat, of course, the Republicans don't care about that. Of course, Charlie Kirk doesn't care about that. He doesn't care about the 22 million people who just filed for unemployment. They'll fight more aggressively than anyone to maintain the system we're living under. But then Donald Trump quote tweets that because of course he does. And this is the kind of stuff that gets the Donald Trumps of the world elected because he positions himself as someone who's morally superior when it comes to looking out for the working class, period.
You're 100% right. And then, of course, the demand on us becomes, why are you not defending Nancy Pelosi?
It's not my job. Not my job to defend Nancy Pelosi. Yep.
It's not our job. I think Brendan from the Majority Report pointed out that the Nancy Pelosi meme that has not happened yet is her washing her hands to get rid of Corona, but doing one of her fucking claps. That'll be the definitive Democratic resistance answer to Corona. You have a lot of people in the Democratic Party who are purely in politics for symbolism, and they don't care about the consequences of anything else. And that is never going to be reconcilable with a materialist project.
Absolutely. It's the optics of resistance. It's not true resistance. But I do also want to note that there are some Democratic lawmakers who are proposing excellent legislation. Of course, you have the Bernie Sanders of the world, but, Ro Khanna, Rashida Tlaib, they are fighting for a $2,000 a month universal basic income for 6 months. And then people would also get some financial assistance for up to a year after the pandemic. And that's to ensure that people really do get back on their feet and are able to provide for themselves, for their families, to get their small businesses in order. There was a report about how 20% of small businesses are expected to shutter permanently as a result of this pandemic. The $350 billion that Congress had set aside to help small businesses has already run out. And it's shameful to see where the priorities are, where they've been. I mean, we've known this, but the examples are just really starting to pile up. And I just think it's laughable and shameful to put all of our focus and energy on shaming people who refuse to endorse a subpar candidate who has done terrible things legislatively in his political career.
The major reason we're here. I agree with you completely, Anna. So I think what we're going to do is we're going to take a brief break, and then we're going to come right back with Aaron Bastani of Novara Media, and he is going to defend the Labour Party. No, I'm just kidding. That's not what he's going to do. We'll be right back. This is Weekend. Welcome back. This is Weekends with Aaron Kasparian and Michael Brooks. I'm Michael Brooks. Joining us now is our friend from across the pond, Aaron Bastani of Novara Media. I guess I should say across two ponds in the context of this show. Aaron, how are you?
I'm going to try and center my shot, but look, you can see I don't know my left from my right. I'm good. How are you guys doing?
I also don't know my left from my right, but I'm fine.
I'm doing well, thank you.
So, Aaron, you have been all over these, basically these revelations of this internal war inside the Labour Party against Jeremy Corbyn. For people who haven't read into this yet, but maybe have a little bit of a sense of UK politics, where it was very clear that the center and right wing of the British Labour Party, of the UK Labour Party, that public figures, including obviously Tony Blair, but many others, regularly trashed Corbyn in public, regularly undermined his leadership, briefed against him constantly. In the context of that knowledge, what is the escalation in terms of revelation here?
Revelation is a word that's used in political journalism probably too much. I mean, we probably all agree on that. But these are revelatory. There's no other way to put it. They clarify all the misgivings, all the prejudices, all the biases that the very worst ultra-leftist could have about the Labour Party. And I think they're also pertinent to an American audience. Because right now, of course, there's a lot of hearsay about how the Democratic establishment behaves. But we have here confirmed some things which really, I think even I sort of struggle to really believe they were true. One is, and this is yet to really come out, because there's a second bunch of leaked documents, that they were actively considering, that is to say the senior management within the Labour Party team, its executive directorate, not a press officer, not the T-boy, were looking to actively suspend the 2015 leadership election as it became increasingly clear that Jeremy Corbyn won. Now, I'll have an article about that out next week. This is senior management, in their own words, looking to do this. So it's astonishing, and it really undermines the credibility, actually, of British democracy. Not in a way that people don't have the vote, but how the party system is inflected with specific elite interests, which I don't think any normal person kind of thinks happens, or if they suspect it happens, now we know it's out in the open.
So I feel like a lot of the emphasis on political discussions, at least in the United States, is on discussing policy, the candidates themselves. But while there might be some suspicions about the institutions and how they play a role in the outcome of elections, I don't think that there's enough criticism and a hard look at what we need to do about these institutions, how to reform them, how to ensure that they do protect a democratic process. What has the fallout been? Have these discussions begun in the UK? Is there any discussion about maybe reforming the Labour Party, especially those at the top who very much played a role in undermining Jeremy Corbyn?
Well, so the first thing to say is that I keep on doing this. Oh my God, look. So that's it. Here we go. Right. I want to get this just right for your great audience. The first thing is to say that they're a wonderful audience. Don't forget to like and subscribe.
Tremendous job. Smash the like button.
The first thing is to say that Keir Starmer has said he'll have a formal independent investigation. Now, that matters for a couple of reasons. One is there's a lot of stuff here. There's far more than is in the public eye. You're looking at around 10,000 pages of emails and WhatsApp messages. Now, 10,000 pages is a hell of a lot. So that's important. And because it's been given official sanction, that will be covered in the media and scrutinized and so on, whether that's 6 months or a year or whatever. So there's a huge long-term story here, which isn't going away. In the short term, there's a few issues. First of all, this hasn't been reported on by the mainstream media, so to speak. There's been a piece in the Tribune, a couple of pieces in Tribune you just posted there. We've done 3 or 4 pieces. I think within 2 days of us posting the first piece on Novara Media, it got 250,000 uniques. So the Guardian has no excuse. Okay, you might need to talk to a lawyer, you might need to spend a bit of money for a few hours, fine. But it was absolutely, from their point of view, commercially, perfectly worth doing. So the reason they didn't do it, I can only presume, is political. And the Guardian's coverage of the story has been, negligible. There's been a couple of comment pieces. There's been no original reporting or news gathering. This is in no way something you might approximate to journalism. And I think it really does belie the fact, we've said for years now, we don't have a socialist media, we have a liberal media. I'm worried we don't even have a liberal media. And I think that's something which really pertains to The Guardian, but of course there's many outlets in the US where there would be similar misgivings, I think. So my main kind of surprise, I think, is the absence of coverage from so-called progressive journalists, because the revelations in this thing are astounding. Senior management in the Labour Party in 2017 didn't want their party to win that election. 2 years earlier, 2015, they tried or considered suspending the leadership election internal to that party. There are repeated efforts, in their own words, to effectively rig internal candidate selection, bullying, the coordination with journalists to harass a black journalist, a black politician, Diane Abbott, as she was crying in a cafe, having a breakdown after reporting an avalanche of racist abuse to the police. That same day, a senior member of management, right? This is not a press officer, a T-boy. We have it in their own words, was coordinating with a very hostile Channel 4 journalist to find out where she was. He said, she's in this place. You can go find her there. Now, this is just remarkable. And the language that's being used, I mean, I hope you don't mind me saying, the pube head, stupid fucker. It was just the quotidian use of language by people at the very top of the Labour Party. A few months after Jeremy Corbyn won the first time, almost immediately after he won the first time, efforts to get rid of him. A few months after he won the second time, efforts to get rid of him. And what was most remarkable of all, I think, is you can understand all of that through the prism of they want to win. That's the argument that the Democratic or that the Labour Party establishment will give. Well, look, we just care so much about power. That's kind of why we're assholes sometimes to people on our left. Well, hold on a second. Explain to me why these very same people, as Labour were rising in the polls in 2017, I'm sure many of your audience are aware of that, the better Labour were doing, the more fearful Labour became. And actually, in the words of one senior member of staff, one of the most senior members of staff, the day after the general election, I can't get out of bed. I can't, pull my eyes over the duvet because they were so distraught. Labour had just got their best share of the vote for 20 years.
I wish we could find out where they were and sick a journalist on them.
Isn't that remarkable? They would rather, that's the thing we say the Democratic, I don't know. We haven't got proof for the Democratic establishment. We have proof for the Labour establishment. They in their own words, they would rather have the Tories win than the Labour Party if it was running on a left programme. It's kind of crazy.
Yeah, and in terms of the fallout, I had on a really great Labour organizer and law instructor, Paul O'Connell, on my show a couple of days ago. And one of the things he said that was very concerning to him about Starmer's response, and maybe you could talk about your perception of the new Labour leader more generally, was that the response to these revelations was basically, we need to have an investigation. And in O'Connell's representation, and this is my interpretation too from looking at it, but I'm curious your thoughts, obviously, that there is a disturbing sort of symmetry in the response of the new Labour leader that, okay, yeah, some of this looks kind of distasteful, we got to look into it. But what we've really got to look into, and maybe I'm stretching here, but I'll stretch a little. When The Intercept, proved what was obvious about the Lava Jato investigation and what they had done to Lula and the Workers' Party, the only defense and the only counterplay that the Lava Jato team had was, well, the real thing here is that this was released to begin with, and we have to study that. And O'Connell said that the investigation looks to be kind of 50-50. Are we talking about the Labour Party trying to lose and politically terrorize its own leadership, or are we just scared that this got out into the public domain?
That's a great question, because we hear often investigations or inquiries are just a way of kicking a political issue into the long grass. In a way, and that may be the case here. But the thing is, if you do have a full investigation, all that's going to do is make all of this become a big public story. So it may be a way of delaying and deferring. And yes, I think they're going to try and elevate process as the main story here, or the fact it was leaked as the main story. But I think just given the sheer quantity of the data and the quality, or rather kind of, and I mean that in a sort of disgusting sense, just how bad some of the things are, I don't think that would be possible. I'll give you an example. You're probably familiar with a football stadium in Merseyside, which is one of the kind of, it's this will vote Labour until the end of time. It was one of the working class areas. It doesn't matter your income, whatever. It's just Labour through and through. In the last general election where there were struggles elsewhere, Brexit wasn't even an issue, even though the area voted Remain. Now, in 2017, a football club called Tranmere, the third club of Liverpool, basically, Jeremy Corbyn did a rally there, thousands of people there. And that was the first time you had people chant, "Oh, Jeremy Corbyn." And there was a response to this. The tweet went out. Somebody tweeted about it. This was being discussed by senior management. And one of the members of senior management said, "Oh my God, this looks like #junkies for Jez." Junkies for Jez. this is just working class Northwestern voters, the white working class voter, which we're told the Labour right so loves. They think they're junkies, Right. And by the way, I have no issue with people on drugs who want to politically organize. But I'm just saying it's a remarkable animosity, enmity, hatred of working people. And that shines through in every page. So on the one hand, I agree with your guest, Paul, about that. And I think there's clearly going to be other countervailing interests. You're already seeing this, where there's going to be a focus on, how dare this be leaked? But the reality, the grim reality for these people is that under British law, whistleblowers are protected. The reason why we've published articles is we've consulted lawyers. There is a outstanding public interest for the publication of these things. So, that's just not going to wash. Again, it's about so-called liberals coming up against the limits of liberal democracy. Liberal democracy is quite like whistleblowers. Turns out liberals, whether it's in the media or in the Labour Party, many of them don't like it.
Yeah, it is really interesting. I want to go back to what you said about the media pretty much ignoring this story and refusing to cover it. I think it's important to kind of talk about how this report came about in the first place, because the media had absolutely no problem accusing Jeremy Corbyn and the Labour Party of anti-Semitism. That was a line of attack that they, incessantly reported on. But the whole point of this report was to investigate, right, anti-Semitism within the party. And it turns out that the very people who, tried to prevent any true action in response to the racism and anti-Semitism were undermining Jeremy Corbyn. So why is it that the media all of a sudden has no interest in anti-Semitism? I find that curious.
Well, I can give you some sort of quite striking examples. So Lisa Nandy, who was a candidate for the leadership election, which culminated a few weeks ago, earlier this month. She, in January, was calling for the full release of this report, the full release, her words, full, immediately. And now, of course, it says things that perhaps people don't want to hear. Nobody's saying that anymore. The GMB was a major trade union which was backing her. Now the GMB is saying, the whistleblowers need to be protected. Hold on a second. You were backing a candidate in January demanding the full release of this document. Your problem is you don't like what's in it. And it's a very similar story last year. There was a documentary by Panorama. Many of the people outlined in this document, the whistleblowers, it turns out, many of them didn't have the best of intentions. When they went to Panorama, people were saying these people are whistleblowers, they're protected. People like Tom Watson, named in this document. People like the GMB said we have solidarity with whistleblowers. Yet when it's people doing the precise same thing, all of a sudden this is an outrage and people's private personal rights are being compromised. There is always, of course, an argument with regards to data breaches and whether there is, a sufficient public interest for something to be in the public realm. Clearly, people who've made complaints, their names should not be in public circulation. I view that as an issue for journalists. You can't say, they should have given the journalist a redacted version. Well, then how the hell is a journalist going to know what should go in or out of a story? So I have full solidarity with the whistleblower, and I think this has become an issue. It's just frankly absurd. Something I've said is, it's a shame that Harvey Weinstein wasn't perhaps friends with some of these people, because the analog is, they would have blamed Rose McGowan. They would have said Mr. Weinstein has a right to personal private rights. There are some very serious allegations in this document. I don't say that lightly. Incredibly serious allegations. A group of people trying to effectively lose a democratic election in a major Western country. So there's clearly sufficient interest here for the thing to be in the public realm.
The parallels, one quick follow-up, the parallels with what we're experiencing in the United States is actually kind of incredible, especially when it comes to whistleblowers and how the Democratic Party saw Julian Assange as some hero prior to the 2016 election, someone who deserves to be protected, someone who's sharing information that we all really need to know about, someone who can be considered a journalist in his own right. And then as soon as there are suspicions that he's helping Donald Trump get elected, he's now a pariah. So there are incredible similarities between
those are the libs. The national security Democrats always hated him, but I like it. True. It's like the Guardian parallel. It's great until it's it could threaten us.
Well, look, what you see with a lot of establishment Democrats, a lot of people in the Labour establishment is they're driven in politics by two things. The first is to just be in charge. Just, it's like when you're a kid, some 5-year-olds just want to play, some want to be in charge. That's like a big impulse here. And another one is anti-socialism, a hatred of the left, which again comes across in these documents. And so I think, you look at these liberals, I mean, are they liberals? They're people who want to be in charge. They don't want to be conservatives, and they hate the left. I mean, what is that? I don't quite know. I mean, there's a strong liberal tradition. Liberals have done some amazing things in history. Universal suffrage, gender equality, etc. were all part of that historical sort of ideology tradition coming out in the 19th century. So, I mean, I don't know what you want to call these people. They're often not Democrats when it suits them. They're often not progressives when it suits them. They certainly don't give a damn about women's rights when it suits them. I mean, look at what's going on right now with Joe Biden. So, I mean, we probably on the left, we probably need to come up with a new term for this sociological category. And it isn't a particularly broad one, by the way. It's not like some million-strong voter demographic. These are people who overwhelmingly find themselves in political careers.
Yeah, I mean, maybe, and I mean this in the governance sense, definitely not a populist sense, but Singaporeans. I mean, I honestly, I do think you could look at some of the governing model of Singapore as where these people's minds go, as the kind of like the ideal way to govern and the ideal way to do meritocracy and capitalism, and even a kind of limited cosmopolitanism, which does make them distinct from what you see in Trump and Bolsonaro and Hungary and so on. But I think this is also something that's really important to think about too. I have, and I've talked about this, my problems philosophically and politically with kind of moralism and cancel culture and that whole kind of bundle of things. And I think that there's innate big picture problems with that. I think the left actually really does. If you want to have a redemptive, change-oriented culture, you have to have a redemptive, change-oriented culture. And really build that ethos. And I obviously am really influenced by like a Cornel West in that approach, and very influenced by the Vampire Castle essay as well, which I always recommend to people. But there's also a very tangible political aspect to this, which is these sort of controversies, and we'll just focus for this conversation on the anti-Semitism thing, that when you recognize that these are people that will just weaponize these things, that don't have them in any sort of good faith. In other words, they're going to, when it's going after their political opponents, they will either take something that, say, is a genuine mistake, but, can be changed, can be addressed, whatever, or actually completely fabricate or make things up, or say that something like, keeping on this theme, like, criticizing the Israeli occupation or the siege on Gaza is anti-Semitism. And I think that the left, in some ways, actually, because it hasn't really resisted this stuff generally, which I absolutely think it should, has also just been played by these people, because it's like, obviously, when push comes to shove, of course, it's not going to apply, to their own, political circles, and we see it play out in a million different ways. So I think that there's a way in which, again, it's like the cultivating a better scene and more compassionate scene on the left actually also correlates with being a lot more savvy about power and understanding what exactly you're up against.
Yeah, I would absolutely agree with that in its entirety. I mean, a few things, and the sort of weaponizing of a certain leftist, for want of a better term, identity politics. It's so sort of capacious. It can mean a bunch of things, but hopefully your sort of audience will give me the charity of explaining what I mean. For instance, you would have 10 people would say this is racist, right? And there'll be people of color. And people will say, quite rightly, you need to censor people of color and their experience of racism, and they get to define it. And that's absolutely true. But we also have to believe in objective truth, right? So I'm of Iranian heritage. If I'm with 5 other people and we're all of Iranian heritage, and we determine this particular thing is Islamophobic and anti-Iranian, that doesn't mean we get to determine the objective reality of the situation. Other people might say, well, actually, that doesn't really correspond with facts. That doesn't correspond with how we understand as a society prejudice, racism, equal opportunity, universal human rights, etc. And there's an element of the left which didn't buy into that. So like when people say, oh, that's racist or that's sexist or that's whatever, because these people say it is, and that's the only prerequisite for it being true, I think the left does have to push back and go, well, that's, we have on the left, we have to believe in an objective truth, right? We have to believe in like the possibility of a straight person having solidarity with a gay person or a white person having solidarity with a black person. If we don't believe that can be bridged, if we don't believe that people can understand that despite these things, they have more than just shared interests, they have shared humanity, then what are we doing? So I think that's the first thing. I think this kind of radical identity politics, I agree with you, was really cleverly exploited. So you see it with Bernie Sanders. Bernie Sanders hates black people. Why? Because, well, look, these 5 BAME activists all say that he's anti-black. Well, okay, well, let's look at the guy's historical track record. Let's see what other civil rights activists say. Let's look at the political context within which he's operated for 30, 40 years. As a white politician, he ain't anti-black. So I agree with you. And I think it's right to say that it's something the left is going to have to get very savvy about. And I think we're going to come out the other side of this a bit more intelligent.
Read Adolph Reed.
Yeah, definitely.
Always what I say.
Also, I do think it's important to point out that the very people who usually, like politicians, who want to focus on, that like pro-minority messaging, and they then accuse others, whether it's candidates, voters, of being racist, sexist, homophobic. Usually they use that as a line of attack without really reflecting on how their own policies have actually carried out actions and like a system that codifies racism, codifies sexism, codifies, the Islamophobic behavior that we're seeing abroad, for instance, with the United States and its foreign policy. So I think it's also important to call out like just the shallowness of the argument, because it's used as a tool to like bludgeon political opponents. But we need to be able to like effectively message that they're the ones who have done something substantive in hurting various groups of disenfranchised people.
Yeah, so I mean, that's absolutely right. I think the 2 issues that ultimately did for Jeremy Corbyn in the end, one was Brexit, and the other was anti-Semitism. And these are issues where the left should be comfortable, right? Anti-racism, and being at the front of a movement for maintaining what many, I think, wrongly see as a sort of international alliance, a cooperation between nation states, which is, progressive in some way. So how was Jeremy Corbyn defeated by 2 things, which ultimately that would be counterintuitive? He wasn't beaten because people don't want good public services or because they want to tax the rich. That wasn't what defeated him in the end. Now, I don't know if that would have be the same case in the US or whatever, if there was, say, Sanders, Trump in a presidential runoff. I can't say. What I can say is I think predictively, had that happened, Sanders' biggest problems wouldn't have been that he was going to tax the rich, wouldn't have been Medicare for all. It would have been people probing for an Achilles heel to his left, where he was weak, for instance, on gender rights or minority issues of some kind or something in his history. That's what they would have looked for. Now, Sanders, in a way, was better placed than Jeremy Corbyn because, of course, you have a different system. Jeremy Corbyn was in a parliamentary party. He had hundreds of colleagues willing to basically denigrate him publicly every day in a way that Sanders doesn't, right? In the presidential system, it's a bit different. So I think that's true. But in terms of the scoping out thing, New Labour in this country, probably more than the Democrats, actually, because, you had a Republican president from 2000 to 2008. New Labour in this country are responsible for some horrific racist policies, horrific. And the very same people who built Yarlswood Detention Centre, the very same people who introduced all manner of racist policies, effectively trying to isolate potentially radicalized Muslims from a very young age, 3, 4. The people that introduced these policies were calling a man who had, fought against apartheid, had been in every single demonstration for every single minority issue you can throw a stick at. They were calling him a racist. And like you say, Anna, I think that's something the left is going to have to sort of work out. How do we want to engage with these issues? I think the politically savvier people go, you know what, go screw yourself. I'm not going to play that game. But because most of the left were like, well, no, we're nice. We're good people. We don't say go screw yourself when somebody's bringing up minority issues. And I think that showed a lack of political education. More people need to be like that. Have a thicker skin. You know, we're in politics against some really nasty bastards, really nasty people. And if you're an anti-racist, sometimes you're going to have to say to them when they're playing that game, you're talking crap, you don't mean it, you're the enemy.
Oh, absolutely. I mean, we spent 2 weeks of the primary election focusing on an accusation that Bernie Sanders told Elizabeth Warren that a woman can't win as president. It was a private conversation. We don't have a direct quote. But you're right. I mean, they didn't attack him policy-wise. They attacked him on something that has to do with gender that no one can prove. Yeah. And it was disgusting how the media jumped on that and wouldn't let it go for 2 weeks straight.
Yeah. I mean, whenever I'm sort of confronted with this sort of thing, when I've been confronted with this sort of thing with Corbyn, I would say, well, look, can that be proved in a court of law? No, you don't just, no reasonable person goes, well, was there an impartial, was there a witness? Is there a context to that behavior? Do they have previous? You know, if that went to a court, that kind of pattern, they go, this one thing happened, but nobody else saw it. We say, get the hell out of here. And that's what we need to do as a movement on the left, right? Just don't take it seriously. And there's a fine line there, but if it's obvious that somebody has bad intentions and they've got no real case, tell them to go screw themselves.
Well, yeah, I mean, but I also want to say too that I think it also, as part of being more savvy and adult, it also does have to even, I mean, I don't believe for a second that Bernie said that to her. I just don't buy it. There's no part of that story that makes any sense. But say he said it. So, like, you know, that wouldn't be his greatest moment of his life. But are we not going to vote for single payer health care? Are we not going to vote? Like, it's ridiculous. And I think, again, in terms of just the sort of having some realism and humility, because, again, I think the other paradox about the way these things get wheeled out is that if we actually took them seriously, then we would recognize that we could all be implicated at them one time or another, and it's an ongoing process of evolution and change. And then that humility actually might make you, again, much more savvy, but also a lot more, you know, forgiving and thoughtful, frankly. And I will say, I think the thread through Adolph Reed that kind of connects these things, though, is that it makes perfect sense why the Clintonites of the 1990s were pioneers in racism and race baiting and using specifically demonizing black people to show that they were, quote unquote, different kinds of Democrats, or that New Labour talked about dumping as literally migrants coming into the UK. And now they're the big, you know, kind of like woke splainers of politics. And it's because those are both essentialist positions. I mean, those are both different ways. One is more ugly and destructive for sure, but they're different ways of slicing and dicing an electorate instead of building a movement, and not building on bonds and looking for areas of division that can reinforce at the end of the day what are, you know, neoliberal policies. I almost feel like we have to stop using the term neoliberal, but at the end of the day, that's what it is.
I think there is a difference, though, between what's happened in the UK and the US, I think. So, for instance, one of the stories which has been documented, as I've talked about, a gentleman called Patrick Hennigan, senior member of management, who did what he did to Diane Abbott. I don't believe that would happen in the United States. I do think. Well, let me say why. If you look at the composition of senior management at the Labour Party, if you look at the people in employed staff roles, if you look at the bureaucrats of that party, if you look at the wider Labour movement in this country, of course, the Democrats and the Labour movement in the United States have problems with race. I'm not suggesting otherwise. But I think in this country, we're significantly further back. I think there's the absence of you might call a sort of a black elite politics in the US, which it doesn't really exist here. Probably because it's a far smaller part of the country's population. There's a different historical experience for obvious reasons. But I do not, the hatred which is expressed towards Diane Abbott, to Dawn Butler, to other black politicians. Clive Lewis is also in this document. There's a clear anti-black racism, which it's not subtle. There's not an undertone. So I agree with you. On the one hand, these guys try to sort of instrumentalize kind of woke politics. On the other hand, somebody who's like 55, some white dude who's never had a real job, he's only ever been in the Labour Party. He even if he wanted to, he can't do that, Michael. So it's a bit of a funny one.
I get it. I mean, I think you're probably right, but I would say that if you really get into at least the ancillary Democratic Party elite treatment of Nina Turner and Breonna Joy Gray, I mean, it's not only is it there, it's public. So if you feel comfortable doing that kind of game playing publicly, I can only speculate what you're saying behind the scenes. But I think to some extent you're probably right, just in terms of kind of relative social progress. But I think the ethos is almost 1-to-1.
Well, I think if you had you have Barack Obama, right? I think if Barack Obama, was in the room when somebody said that, he would say, for instance, and I don't agree with many of his political positions, he would say that's not okay. I do suspect that there's not that presence that you have in the Democratic Party, which is important, by the way, in the age of Trump, because those people are going to be vital in getting enough of the minority vote to defeat the Republicans. I don't think these people in Labour in this country could do that, and that's a big difference.
Yeah, I mean, so where do we go from here? That's one of the big questions that I have, especially for the Labor Party. I mean, we have this issue in the Democratic Party where it's this wide tent with two conflicting ideologies, dominant ideologies. And I see the same thing happening with the Labor Party. So what happens next? What is the strategy for, the Corbyn wing of the Labor Party?
That's a great question. What's underpinning all of this is the same in both countries, isn't it? It's younger people, it's people from minorities, it's people with university educations, it's people in cities who are the backbone of these movements. That's arguably a bad thing in a sense, because you obviously want to win elections which don't include those groups. But those are the people who are getting behind Jeremy Corbyn, voting for him, becoming Labour members, and the same with Bernie Sanders. And they'll be the people that would never vote Trump, would never vote Republican, will always vote Democrat. That's the new base, right? The old base, the Rust Belt states, and or Wisconsin, Ohio. The new base is somewhere altogether different. And that poses problems in terms of when you have an electoral college, right? Because in Britain, and we saw it last December, these seats like Burnley, like Blackburn, former industrial heartlands are getting older. If you're a young person, you leave there to get work in a local major city, Manchester or Leeds, or you go to London. It's the same in South Wales. So actually, even though the demographics are very favourable for left politics, in Britain at least, because of the geography of the country and how people move, we're going to end up in a situation a bit like you have in 2016. You piling up your majorities in California and New York and other parts of the country, and actually 60% of the country isn't with you on an electoral college basis. We have a similar problem here, and that's a challenge for the new left, so to speak. So I suppose the question is, how does that happen within the Labour Party, or how does that happen within the Democratic Party? You guys have primaries, so it's a bit different. We don't have primaries with the Labour Party. I think there's more, even though Bernie's failed. If I was an American, I absolutely would not give up on the Democratic Party. I think, you can really give this a go for a few years yet. In the Labour Party, it's a little bit different. But again, I would say I wouldn't give up. The Labour Party has 35 socialist MPs. We've got three left-wing trade unions, effectively. We've got a lot of new left media, like what you guys are doing over there. There's a lot to build with, but I suppose what I'd finish with is you're going to hear a lot of platitudes about how, the Democrats are a coalition of, the centre, like Joe Biden, and the left. You're a coalition. But what I would say is, one of the major findings of this leaked Labour report is that isn't true. We're not a coalition. When we were in charge, they wanted us to lose. So that's just it's not remotely accurate what they're saying. They talk about a movement. It's all crap, right? Because how can it be a movement when people around, for instance, Keir Starmer, the people backing him, and I'm not blaming any of this at his door, senior management members who all participated in this stuff, who all undermined their party from winning in 2017, now back Starmer. The lady I wrote about in the second article, Emily Oldknow, she was a senior member of staff. She's now the Deputy Secretary General for Unison, the biggest union in the country. She was being touted as the party's general secretary. That's probably not going to happen now, right? The most senior staff position. She was doing extraordinarily appalling things. And she was going to be in a position of incredible seniority in the Labour Party. Now, that isn't a coalition, right? Because that person wanted the party to lose. And I suppose there's going to come a point where, we're going to have those conversations on the left. Well, what does that mean then? What if this isn't a coalition? What if these people who are very powerful within these institutions, but actually in society more broadly aren't particularly big, and they're certainly not the future, How do we respond to that? And I suppose we can only really think about that as a left, whether it's in the US, the UK, after your election in December, if it happens. What happens with Biden versus Trump is going to, I think, really pose major questions for the left for the next 10, 15 years.
Absolutely. Aaron Bastani, we really appreciate your time. Everybody check out Novara Media. Go over there, smash subscribe, or hit subscribe. You smash like and hit subscribe, might be. And follow all of this really important reporting on what's happened in the Labor Party. I mean, it's extraordinary. It's
for an American audience, it is. I think is almost as important as for a British audience. So yeah,
definitely.
They should definitely read about it. Okay, great to chat to you guys.
Stay safe, man.
Bye.
Bye. So, yeah, we'll take a real brief break. Guys, if you're watching this, as I say, hit the like button, hit subscribe, and there is a massive catalog already on this channel of stay-at-home teach-ins on Gramsci, on a variety of other really important topics. If you haven't watched it yet, watch the panel I did with Cedric Johnson, Adolph Reed, and Willie Leggett on South Carolina and the mystique of the black vote. And of course, weekends are here with Anna and I, so stay on board for the Jacobin channel. We're going to take a brief break. We'll be right back with Strategy and Salt.
Hey guys, welcome back to Weekends with Anna and Michael. So we just wrapped up our interview with Aaron Bastani, and we want to just, do a little debrief and discuss some additional points. One thing that I wanted to bring up, and I think this is important when you discuss power that progressives have versus power that the Democratic establishment has in the United States. We have to also think about like various transactional relationships that the Democratic Party has with the very people or organizations that progressives need to have deeper ties to. So for instance, as important as labor unions are, we need to consider how, labor unions themselves, especially the most powerful labor unions, do their own lobbying toward the Democratic Party in order to get certain things that they need. And there are establishment Democrat types like Nancy Pelosi who have helped them accomplish some of their goals. And so that's power. That's a transaction that increases the power of the very people we've been fighting against within our own party. And so there needs to be a discussion about what to do to kind of like reset that situation, right? Because I think a point that you make candidly, Michael, and I don't really hear it anywhere else, maybe because it's a very difficult message to even consume or consider. The progressive arm of the Democratic Party clearly does not have the type of power that it needs, right? We're not as powerful as some of us might think we are. If we were, then the Joe Biden as a candidate wouldn't very candidly say that he's considering Republicans in top level positions within his administration. That was a recent interview that Joe Biden did, and he admitted that. And so over and over again, the Democrats show that they have no interest in catering to what we need, right? Or what we want. They'll bully us if we decide we don't want to vote for the Democratic candidate, but they do nothing to cater to us. They do nothing to appeal to us. And it's because they genuinely don't feel that they need to.
Yeah, and the thing is they don't right now. I mean, I think, again, this is part of like being really real about where we're at, and I think goes forward with some like important strategic questions about how we actually move forward. And I want to just say, like, the incredible, positive, amazing thing about the Bernie Sanders campaign, both campaigns, that will keep into the future is that tons of people were trained in some form of how to do political engagement or actual tactics of organizing. A lot of people came to some form of class consciousness, recognition of real interests and who's opposed to those interests, obviously throughout corporate America and in both parties. So these are really positive things. It's not in any way about being like a bummer or anything like that, but you see it in all of these sort of like impotent responses, like, okay, and there's a really good piece in Jacobin by a friend of mine, a guy I've just started to get to know a little bit, whose name I'm completely, I apologize, just totally spacing. I'm not getting enough sleep. But it was basically something to the effect of just even the argument about whether or not it's in the Democratic Party or a third party is just the cart before the horse. Mm-hmm. And this also echoes a conversation, I'll do my fourth citation, of Adolf Reed, of it doesn't matter in a certain way. Like, if you create a third party vehicle on a state level whose primary means are to activate people into politics in a generational sense, then that can be useful. The Bernie Sanders campaign did that, so it's incredibly useful. Various campaigns of people going on strike or organizing for Medicare for all, those are the various ways in which people can start to congeal together and build power. And then when actual power is built, who knows how it will manifest. But again, it just isn't there yet. And I think, there's one tendency to think that some type of kind of like symbolic self-immolation will do something, which just won't. Like, I get it. You're pissed off. You're disgusted. You hate these people. Great. Totally. A third party vote, Trump reelected, not good. Biden elected, I would say slightly less relentlessly damaging, but not good. Because then you hear the other thing of people's like, oh, we've got these platform committees and all that stuff. That stuff doesn't matter. Mm-hmm. It's irrelevant. It's silly. And the big takeaway again is just that we really lost. And I think with regards to the labor unions and that sort of contingent of the Democratic Party, that's an interesting thing to look at. And I think that maybe to some element, that's where the future is, because there is a difference in where I will defend these unions, even though they're not being strategic, they're not being visionary or aggressive. And of course, they cape for all sorts of trash politicians like Biden or Pelosi or whatever. But at the same time, what they're trying to do is protect little tiny slices that they can still deliver real things for in a completely gutted, deindustrialized economy. And I really do think that, and this is why I wish the campaign not only recognized that it was a Sanders and Biden race from the beginning, but also that instead of worrying about, how many people that you can like persuade in the Warren coalition, which isn't that many people, that like, no, Bernie actually has better blog posts than your candidate, that you really went and you looked at what would it take to persuade someone like my grandmother, frankly, I've been mentioning, who's, worked in unionized job her whole life, who certainly has a connection and respect for people, frankly, like Roosevelt and Truman, does not dislike Bernie at all, but is also, she's older. She's not going to vibe with some of the rhetoric. She's going to feel comfortable with Joe Biden, and so I think that maybe there's a path there, and something that needs to happen is on one hand, this supporting these movements that are arising in terms of like spontaneous labor strikes and rent strikes and things like that. But on the other hand, I think there actually needs to be more bridges built, if they can be, between people on this kind of new left, kind of like downwardly mobile, overeducated millennials and traditional labor groups. And we have to see what comes out of those conversations. Absolutely. Yeah, I think you're 100% right. I don't blame these labor groups for the transactional relationship they have with the Democrats that fight progressives. I think that in this context, it makes sense for what they need for their workers. But what you just said is absolutely right. We need to think about how progressives can forge a relationship with these labor unions that's powerful enough to overcome the power that's been given to these Democrats. Because, when we have these conversations about labor unions, in some cases endorsing, without any of their workers having a say, endorsing people like Nancy Pelosi, we have to ask why. It's not because the labor union's leadership is necessarily bad. There are transactions behind the scenes that we need to think about. We need to think about what the deliverables are to these unions, because, fact of the matter is, when it comes to actual policy, like perfect example is the Medicare for All debate that happened during the primaries. So you keep hearing from establishment Democrats that the unions are against Medicare for All because they've fought so hard for the health care that they've provided for their employees, right? So there's, again, a transactional relationship that's being protected, that's being cited in the middle of these debates. Now, we all know that Medicare for All would not only improve the lives of the workers who are under that union, but it would improve the lives of all Americans, regardless of whether they're in a union or not. And so, again, it's not to shame the unions for having that kind of relationship. It's to understand why they have it and to start thinking strategically of how we can build that type of relationship to broaden our base, our coalition, and, just move the power structure in a more favorable direction. Exactly. And the only other thing I'll add to that is that this is also where, and I'll cite Paul O'Connell again, because these conversations are on my mind, where he's like, this is where you really do need a politics that is rooted in some understanding of where people's relationships to the economy are, and not just about like doing the right thing or having the right values or things like that, right? Because you got to go to people where they're actually at. And I think one of the paradoxes of that is when you kind of drop the moralism and the missionary vibe and try to really look at what people are doing in terms of trying to guard their material interest or think strategically about why they're doing what they're doing, it actually is, you become much less arrogant and much more open, and you actually listen to people a lot more closely. And then that actually becomes part of the project of making a left project much more mass appeal. Definitely. Yeah. Because the moralism and the just the judgy nature of some of these conversations, I think turns people off to what progressives want to fundamentally accomplish. Absolutely. I don't know if we talked about this on air, but we know as an example that both parties are horrifying in terms of housing policies and generate homelessness and will not deal with this issue in any way substantively, right? And obviously I speak as somebody who's dealt with housing insecurity significant times in my life. And then, if somebody owns a nail salon or a small business, and they're like, hey, there's an encampment in front of my store. Now, if they become like Republican, so I want to call the cops and terrorize these people, well, obviously, fuck that person. We're just doing different things. But then conversely, if somebody says, I get all of that, and like this is tricky for how I like go about my day to day, I'm sorry. It's just not going to be good enough to say like, well, you're wrong for even thinking that, because again, you're never going to have a conversation with anybody from any walk of life who's in that situation, including people who might have amazing political values and be enormously contributing to their communities, who wouldn't find that a challenge. And it doesn't mean like I have the answer. I just mean like even just having the ability to have a open dialogue about that, is so important for, in fact, generating the kinds of policies that will get rid of, that will house people.
Yeah, I think you're so right. And I don't think we had this conversation publicly, but I do want to like share something from a way more personal perspective to kind of highlight what you're talking about. So for instance, in the middle of this pandemic, there is a movement to ensure that people aren't forced to pay rent because so many people aren't able to work. As I've mentioned, 22 million people have been laid off. And so it's absolutely ridiculous to expect people to pay their rent. And so I think some of the dialogue coming from the left needs to be more specific. Okay, so for instance, my dad came here as an immigrant, worked as a welder. By the way, he had like an electrical engineering degree in Armenia, but it meant nothing when he came here. So he starts working as a welder, and he actually had a pretty good job, but that got shipped abroad. And then he starts working as a handyman, taking any job possible, and he just was collecting like anything that he could to make a down payment on an apartment building. So that's his retirement. This like small 8-unit or 6-unit apartment building is the property that he relies on for his income, right? He's now like in his mid 70s and, can't do difficult labor. And so this pandemic hits, and my dad, who's consistently rented his apartments under market value because most of his tenants are like college students or people who are older and have fixed income, he comes to me and he's like, okay, look, this is the money I rely on for my retirement, but I'm not going to ask them to pay me rent, right? If they can and they want to, that's fine. But I'm not going to demand that they pay me rent. So what can we do though? Like, cause I need to live, I need to pay my bills, right? So we work something out. Luckily I'm still working and I can, take care of things if need be. Yeah. But at the same time, the rhetoric about landlords is not specific enough because it demonizes all landlords, when in reality, we need to focus on the corporate landlords. These massive corporations that buy up apartment buildings throughout the country do not care about their tenants, do not care about ensuring that people are, not overburdened by their housing costs. These are, vicious corporatists that don't care about average people and they just want to make money. It's fine to have conversations about them, but I think we're too general in demonizing all landlords because there are a ton of people in like LA especially, these, private citizens who have like one building, they put their entire life savings into it because that's their retirement, and they have a personal relationship with their tenants and they love them. And, when my dad sees that rhetoric of the left, and we've talked about this, he gets turned off and he feels like he's made to be the enemy. And so I think precision also matters in the way that we communicate things.
100%. I'll add two things to that. So one, I can hear some pushback to that, which I actually think in some ways is valid, but it goes in the opposite direction of overheated rhetoric, which is like part of the critique is just like the very function of like a rentier economy, which has nothing to do like, you can understand why that is a systems problem in capitalism, and that really actually has nothing to do. Like, one of the things that I actually liked about my read of Marxism is it's very non-moralistic. It could be like, that clearly the fact that like it is advantageous to passively own property over working is an indictment of how we've designed things. Mm-hmm. But it doesn't mean that you personally doing that on a small scale is like, oh, you're a bad person or some type of thing. Now, obviously, first of all, as you're right, the easy and clear point is just center it. Like the predatory, New York or all these other places are run by these disgusting predator companies that run tens of thousands of people's lives, have no concern or care or whatever. And also, yeah, there are mom and pop landlords that are scumbags too.
Oh,
but
for sure.
If you look at it as a function instead of as like an individual decision, that's number one. The second point I want to make too is, and I think this is like also about getting real about the left reaching the mass. And I think it's like really paradoxical because there's a lot of focus, rightly, obviously, in the age of Trump on, racism and xenophobia and abuse of asylum seekers and immigrants. But sometimes it goes into like, again, very utopian rhetoric, which has no immediate relevancy, like about open borders, while at the same time, and I could tell you, like, it's your dad, it's like anybody that you've talked to from any first, second, or third generation immigrant community, and I'm talking from a really broad set, Eastern Europe, the Caribbean, Africa, Asia, like if you don't at least have a rhetorical ability to frankly respect the hustle in like a very real sense, like people having 3 businesses and driving cars and doing accounting and trying to get into real estate, that you have to have some explanation of like why the game is rigged or unhelpful in them doing that. And maybe some other answers about how life can be better for all. But if you come, especially a political movement that is represented by a lot of like downwardly mobile but still privileged people, that's just a political disaster. And you're not going to be able to build a relationship with, Mr. Kasparian.
Yeah. And my dad, he has the right like intentions and instincts.
Yeah.
So, but like, and it's not just about housing, it's about the entire system and how it's all interwoven. So for instance, this was his plan because this is what he needed in order to eventually be able to retire, right? He can't live off of what Social Security gives him. By the way, if it were up to Republicans, Social Security would be completely gutted. People couldn't even rely on that. So in his mind, he's like, damn, I'm self-employed. I'm now a handyman, right? So there's no 401k, there's no retirement fund, there's nothing. So what is my plan for when I can't do these jobs anymore because of my old age? So you're right. It is an issue with how our system is set up. And rather than demonize, private citizens who do what they literally need to do to survive, I think the important thing is to focus on how to change that system so people feel like they don't have to be landlords. They don't have to have this kind of like plan to fall back on when they're not able to physically work anymore.
Exactly. And it should always be about addition, not subtraction. But speaking of the opposite end, some people that actually we do just need to throw some salt on. Mm-hmm. Anna, what do we have to take us out this week? Who are we dunking on?
So I've been incredibly cunty toward this one woman who's in the Senate. I'm just keeping it real. I can't stand this woman because of a number of issues, including like her lack of merit and how she's just robbing people of truth and doing so to get rich. So Georgia has an appointed senator. Her name is Kelly Loeffler. And we found weeks ago that Loeffler and her husband, who is the chair of the New York Stock Exchange, immediately dumped millions of dollars in stocks after Loeffler had a Senate briefing on the seriousness of coronavirus. So this is late January. Senators are briefed on the severity of this pandemic, how much it's going to impact the markets, the economy. And Loeffler, along with other senators, by the way, went ahead and just dumped stocks and then purchased specific stocks that are actually doing really well because they're companies related to working at home. So teleconferencing, those types of things. And so there's been a lot of emphasis on her because of the fact that her husband is the chair of the New York Stock Exchange. She's also the most wealthy senator who has about $500 million in her name. And she wasn't someone who got elected. She was appointed in Georgia by Brian Kemp. And as we all know, Brian Kemp was the Secretary of State in Georgia while he was running his gubernatorial campaign against Stacey Abrams. He stole that election. I feel very comfortable saying that. And then he appoints this goon, Kelly Loeffler. Now, Kelly Loeffler has been attacked and she doesn't like it. So she goes on cable news to defend herself and she blames socialism for what she did. Take a look.
This is a political attack that is designed to distract from the issue at hand and to use this outbreak to play politics. We have addressed this and taken extraordinary measures to make sure that we can't be attacked for our success. This gets at the very heart of why I came to Washington, to defend free enterprise, to defend capitalism, and this is a socialist attack. We have taken extraordinary measures, and I am focused solely on working for Georgians. I've been doing that 7 days a week around the clock. This is a political attack that is designed to distract from the issue at hand and to use this outbreak to play politics. We have addressed this and taken extraordinary measures to make sure that we can't be attacked for our success. This gets at the very heart of why I came to Washington, to defend free enterprise, to defend capitalism, and this is a socialist attack. We have taken extraordinary measures, and I am focused solely on working for Georgians. I've been doing that 7.
All right, so she blames socialism. She thinks that she's only being blamed for her success. Keep in mind that she knew about the severity of coronavirus in late January, and for months after that briefing, she downplayed the severity, which has cost tens of thousands of Americans their lives because people didn't think it was serious until it was. And a lot of people had already contracted the virus. Just to give you some specific numbers on how much she dumped in stocks, Loeffler and her husband sold 27 stocks between January 24th, which was immediately after that briefing, and February 14th at a value of between 1.28 million and 3.1 million, and that's according to Senate disclosure records. They also bought 3 stocks in that time for between $450,000 and $1 million. Including Citrix, which is a software company that does teleconference, and that has boomed for stay-at-home workers. In fact, it was $122 a share when she and her husband purchased those shares. Today, it's about $150 a share. So this woman blaming socialism is ridiculous, especially at a time when... Yeah, well, I mean, socialism saved the day, right? For all these companies that are getting bailed out.
And she did well.
Very well.
I don't know, Anna. I just always think that if I think of normal people who defend politicians like this, and it's just the ultimate cuck move.
Totally.
Like, this is somebody who's just like, she's ripping you off in front of your face. I also, I want to say too, and Tucker is the smartest. He's the one you got to watch. He went after her and Richard Burr, but then he had her on and interviewed her. So I'm not sure. Like, I think a guy like Burr is a total scumbag, but maybe expendable in the modern Republican Party. I'm not sure about her, but yeah, Trump knows how to make his moves, and people like Bannon definitely understand that if you appeal to people on the left economically, that's obviously smart, and Democrats give that nothing but range because they're corporatists. But this combined with Steve Mnuchin saying that most Americans could live off of $1,200 for like several months, for 3 months. I mean, yeah, right-wing populism. Okay, sure.
Yeah, definitely. And also for the people who respond to me tweeting about Kelly Loeffler and say things like, oh yeah, but what about Dianne Feinstein? Because there's some evidence indicating that she also possibly engaged in insider trading, which is a crime. And my response to that is, yeah, she deserves prison too. They should be investigated. If there's evidence, with Kelly Loeffler, it's just so overwhelming. The evidence is so overwhelming. With Dianne Feinstein, it's a little more complicated, but I think they should all be investigated. I think Burr should be investigated. Any other senator who was at that briefing, who then later dumped stocks while downplaying the severity of this coronavirus, they should all be investigated. And if found guilty, they should be in prison. But here's the issue. I mean, while we still have all of these nonviolent drug offenders in our prisons during this pandemic, You have people who have committed actual crimes that have actually hurt countless Americans, and we're not even having a discussion about prison, right? I don't even know if there's ever going to be an investigation, and it's ridiculous. So like the FEC recently said, not the FEC, the FTC recently said that they're going to start investigating the price gougers. Okay, great. That should happen. What about prison for these motherfuckers? What about that? Don't try to distract us with like, oh, we're going to go after those price gougers on Amazon. Good, you should. You should have been on that already. But what are you going to do about these people in positions of power who are honestly responsible for downplaying this virus to the extent where people felt comfortable like rubbing up against each other during spring break? It's disgusting.
It's so disgusting. Oh, the idea of Loeffler telling people to rub up against each other in spring break is pretty sinister too. But yeah, I mean, there's other moves like this. There was the administration, I think, also announced a couple of weeks ago to sort of make sure that companies weren't stealing people's wages during this time. And it's like, well, why weren't you doing that at the beginning, right? Like that sounds like something that should be monitored closely always. You know, I don't know. It's a wild time, and some people think it's clarifying. I don't know about that, but we're just really in like the fuck you phase. Mm-hmm. I mean, this like that. This isn't. I mean, of course, a criminal investigation, but she's not even going to need to resign.
Yeah, I mean, it's absurd, and she's ripping a page out of Trump's book. Trump has revealed to everyone that if you get caught with your hand in the cookie jar, just say, so what? Right. Or deny it and then move on. And that's exactly what's happening over and over and over again. And so, look, I think that what we're seeing, not only with the election, but, you know, the response to this pandemic, both by Democrats and Republicans when it comes to financial relief for average Americans, has been enlightening. We know who our enemies are. So now it's time to fight them, right? And to be ruthless about it. To be Machiavellian about it, to not worry about being called a Bernie bro. Who gives a fuck? Okay, I'm a Bernie bro. So what? Fuck off, right? Like that needs to be the attitude, because the bullying tactics and the denials and they have all sorts of tricks up their sleeves. And we need to start thinking about what kind of tricks we're going to use to fight them.
I always just thought of a Bernie bro as some guy with like a backwards Bruins hat who wanted you to have health care. Like
such an evil
Bernie bros are awesome.
Exactly.
What's wrong with you?
wear it with a badge of honor.
That's right. Absolutely. Original Bernie bros. I want to say earlier it was Dustin Gostala who wrote this great piece that I recommend that everybody check out in Jacobin called "Like It or Not, If We Run Third Party, We Will Lose." But it isn't the same, you know, old argument about that. It's really a question of like, how do you get that power? And then when you actually get that power, then who knows what it will look like, but you'll know you'll have it. And it's not going to come with either, you know, a fantasy about the Democratic Party or a fantasy about the third party. It's back to basics and also building on the momentum we got so far. But Anna, this is our second episode. We crushed it.
I think so.
By the way, you did a really good Trump impression.
I know. Here's the trick. You just need to speak in a very breathy way. Like he always sounds like he finished, like he finished. Like, let's just keep it real.
Ew.
Like, I know.
I was about to say, it sounds like he just like walked up 2 stairs or something. He's not very...
Sure. That's a better image. Let's do that. Let's focus on that.
I just, and the whole thing, I love that the big like symbol of like restored American virility is a guy who's just like, I thought the Cats remake was ridiculous.
Yeah, I know. No, exactly. No, but that's one other thing, right? Like, I think the left needs to portray him for what he is. He's a little bitch. Like, he's constantly crying and whining about what other people are saying about him. He's the most powerful person in the world, and he's crying about nonsense. He's a little bitch. And so, like, I think that there's a lot of value in unmanning him, because he acts like a child and he doesn't act like this like powerful leader. He's constantly crying.
Absolutely. And again, I think there's so many examples, and Lula, Mujica, of people who are, quite powerful, dynamic leaders who also have a real vision and, compassion connected to it. And that's what it's about, not denying people's, finding those qualities appealing, because those qualities are appealing, for sure. I will say, before we wrap up, I remember Trump, though, on Morning Joe running for president, and one of them saying, like, oh, aren't you kind of like a whiner or something? He's like, yeah, I am a whiner. And you know what? I whine, and then I win.
He said that?
He literally said that.
That's pretty incredible. I've never seen that interview.
That was one of those moments where, like, I think he understands things at a very deep level. All right, folks, we'll be back next week. We've got another great episode for you. Of course, you can watch the great Anna Kasparian on TYT. You can watch me on TMBS and all these other places as well. Great guests next week. Great content. We want to hear your feedback. People have been digging it so far. If you haven't yet, smash the like button, hit subscribe. See you. And of course, thank you, Kale. Thank you, Bhaskar. And thank you all.